Alright, here we are, looking at Apology by Plato, another of the Socratic Dialogues. What was your first impression, Will?
First impression, gosh, it would have been nice if there was more dialogue and less monologue. The cross-examination of Miletus was good. I just felt like every other paragraph Socrates was telling his judges not to interrupt him, and that he was really just rambling and going back and forth between a lot of things. And I like the way he talks, don't get me wrong. I just felt that if I was Socrates, I would have stayed more to the course of defending myself and less to the point of disproving everybody and all the charges that came against him, not in an attempt to make himself be free of his charges, but to prove that everyone is unwise and wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point too, just the different format of it. A couple monologues as opposed to the normal dialogue form.
So, he's charged with being a corrupter of youth and that he doesn't believe in God. And apparently, the Athenians are thinking he's sympathetic towards Sparta. And he goes about attempting to disprove those things.
Yeah,
While
I'll read out the first charge and the second charge as well. The first one goes, Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. So that's the first one. And
right.
The second one, put forth by Miletus, it contains something of this kind. It says that Socrates is a doer of evil who corrupts the youth and who does not believe in the gods of the state, but has other new divinities of his own. So that's what the accusers have to say about Socrates.
Right. And so this guy, I forget his name, but this gentleman went over to the Oracle of Delphi and asked who the wisest man in existence was. And the Oracle says Socrates is the wisest man in existence. And when Socrates hears this, he thinks, okay, that's preposterous because I don't think I'm wise at all. I'm going to go find a wise man. And I think that's kind of what started this whole issue that brings him to court, because he goes through town finding people that portray themselves as being wise. And through his Socratic method, usually with an audience, usually the youth, he questions these people until he gets a contradiction in their logic. And then he crucifies them for all to see and disproves that they are wise, and walks away having made an enemy and accepting in his heart of hearts that he is wiser, knowing that he isn't wise and isn't pretending to know things that he doesn't know, and that he's proved this person to be a fraud.
Yes. And it's not that he's proving an individual to be fraud, is that he's slowly coming to the conclusion that nobody has wisdom. First he realizes that once the man who the oracle declared to be the wisest of men was not wise at all by his own definition. He had to surmise that no men were wise if they couldn't match up to what I was saying.
Yes. And that's where he gets the charge of being the corrupter of youth, because as he's going through the city and having these dialogues, there are these students, these pupils that are watching him and enjoying what he's doing, and he's seeking out truth, and they start to imitate him, and they're usually of higher classes, and that's causing some of a bad taste in the mouths of the Athenians, I'll say, because they don't like this whole notion that you can just go up to a man who's powerful and esteemed and apparently wise and just start asking him questions and proving that he's not what he says he is, and that he's full of contradictions.
Yeah, and I think that's really what shows the wisdom of Socrates, is because as soon as he hears that, oh, I'm the wisest person, no, I don't think so. I'll show you real wisdom, and then he fails. So he begrudgingly accepts the fact that he is wiser than most men, but sticks to his grounds that he is not wise.
And I'd argue the opposite, that this proves his lack of wisdom in knowing that he isn't wise, but portrayed as the wisest of men by this oracle of Delphi who speaks for Apollo. He goes out to people who are in positions of authority and power and esteem, and in the most unwisest of manners makes enemies of them all, which leads him to court and inevitable death. And that is probably the most unwise decision I could come up with.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'd like to know what happened inside of Socrates' mind to make him go through with some of the decisions that he did. Which
And
could
I
swing
think,
back to some of our other conversations about analyzing his mental health.
yeah, well, and that's what I was going to say, because he's got this daemon inside of him. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but this spirit that he talks about several times.
It's just a demon or an oracle or a spirit. It's described in many ways.
And you could attribute that to just being a really heightened sense of intuition, that when he goes to do something, he gets this guttural feeling that says, oh, better stop doing that. And he said in the past, he's stopped giving a speech because of this feeling or message or whatever you want to interpret it as, suggesting that it's not a good idea. And yet, it doesn't stop him from doing all these things that piss off the people who have the power. And that is his intention, is to usurp the false prophets, uh the frauds, the fakers of wisdom. And he says he's the gadfly to the steed of Athens.
Yes,
and
exactly.
this is his purpose.
Yeah, I like the Gadfly metaphor a lot. He acknowledges the fact that he's basically just a shit disturber and a contrarian most of the time. He sees that as his utmost value to Athens as a whole, that he's the Gadfly and that if you kill me, you'll never have another like me. So that must leave the Athenians wondering, well, what do you mean by that? Why do we need a horsefly biting us all the time and pissing us off? And what is the real value in that, Socrates? And I don't think he elaborates on that enough.
Yeah, and I think that's his undoing, is that he's got this God-given purpose to seek out wisdom where it may be, and then have this Socratic dialogue with these wise men, only resulting in proving them wrong, and that this is what he's meant to do, and what he's meant to do will lead to this court hearing and his inevitable death. And in recognition of that, he accepts that he would rather die doing what he does best and living his best life than to not live that way, to shut up and just go about living. He says that it is without purpose and without meaning, and that death would be a better choice for him if he was set with the consequence of not being allowed to examine all of these people.
Yeah, and he tries to connect that as a defense to the Heretic Charger, not believing in the gods of Athens. He says, no, I believe in the gods of Athens and serve the gods of Athens more than you do, because this is my true purpose. This is what God set me out to do. And I don't see anyone else doing their purpose the way I am.
Yeah, it's almost like he completely believes in the gods. He's completely in service to the gods. It's the men that he's not so sure of, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he kind of spins the argument around that it's not me who doesn't believe in the gods, it's you, because you worship man instead of the actual gods in heaven that I speak of.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, because he definitely goes on for a while, especially with the cross-examination of Miletus, and explaining how he must believe in gods if he talks about the demigods. So that was almost a moot point. That, of course I believe in gods. It's just simply, this is my God-given purpose. And then it's argued that he might be a sophist. They talk about how he's like a sophist, and he says, well, no, the sophists are these men who play at wisdom, again, like all these other pretenders. They use the argument and persuasion techniques to win quibbles so that they can be put in a position of power where they can make a profit, teaching the youth what it is to be what it is. and yet not knowing what it truly is. Whereas he doesn't ask for payment. He doesn't do this for money. He does this because it's truly his purpose and that he has knowledge to share and that he's seeking out truth and knows he's not wise. He's just simply looking for the truth, and he understands logic. I think he's a very logical, reasonable, rational man that because he knows the extent of his wisdom, he's able to do what it is that he does.
Yeah, there's no intent of victory when Socrates delves into these conversations. It's just a pursuit of truth and an examination of the heavens and the earth. And he never takes payment. And that's one of his, another refutation to the charge that he is a teacher of the youth and corrupter, because he's not actually taking the role of a teacher and being paid to instruct these students. He's just having conversations with them, and they're on their own changing their minds.
And then there's a good argument in there where he talks about how unlikely it would be that everyone in the nation is doing everything for the good of all members of the nation, and that there'd be only one corrupter of the youth, and how unlikely it is that a neighbor would corrupt his neighbor only to have that neighbor come back and bite him.
Yeah, when Socrates asks, like, who are the other corrupters of the youth, or is it just me? Because if it's just me, then that's a pretty unfortunate situation for myself.
And I found that really interesting, I'll say, because obviously there's so many forces at play in any society where the youth are able to be corrupted, and to have this man who's like in his 70s going around just trying to find the truth be the poster boy of corruption in a society that is warring with nations and worshiping gods as part of their daily role in society, because of course church and state were completely married in Greek society, right? It is an interesting book to read, an interesting setting to imagine.
Yeah. It's interesting to see, like, all the similarities and the differences in the way the ancient Greeks interacted with each other.
Like when you look at what's going on today, right? And I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to be putting myself into a pigeonhole, but there are individuals out there on YouTube and other platforms who are engaging in healthy civil discourse with people on opposite party lines, trying to discuss hot topics and get to the truth of the matter. And there are religious bodies and there are religious organizations and there are political groups that are very much against this discussion of truth. And they want to shut it down, and they don't care about freedom of speech because they don't want to be host to these talks. And we're seeing right now an interesting point in our society where people who genuinely are discussing what is true and what may lead to good are having a hard time, and they're being suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially, I don't know how much you're paying attention to the way YouTube's been operating lately, but YouTube is actually demonetizing channels that it doesn't agree with their views. So if you don't have the right set of values, if you don't have the right set of beliefs, and you're discussing actively things that they don't want you to discuss, you don't make any money. Your profit goes away and you get a strike. You get a hard strike, you get 3 of them, you're kicked off YouTube, you're done.
Yeah, it's pretty sad.
You have university campuses with student protection organizations that are preventing the discussion of particular conversations on campus. Speakers are being banned. You have people standing up for freedom of speech who are getting a lot of flack for it. And it's happening south of the border, north of the border, east of the border, west of the border. It's happening all over the world in every free-speaking society right now, where just discussing what is true chemically, biologically, philosophically, just even with physics. I don't know when the last time you saw a flat earther come up, but they keep popping up.
They're everywhere, man.
And it's baffling. There's no other
Yeah.
word for it. It's baffling that we've been having this issue for 2,500 years, at least if you look at the dialogues of Socrates, that people who want to say, no, this is the truth. We've done the math. We've done the work. We've been doing the work in the math for thousands of years. This is what's going on. And people say, I don't agree based on my opinion.
And their short-sighted views of the world that they live in. Like, I don't see a curve when I look at the lake. I don't see the curvature of the earth. It must be flat.
Yeah.
And don't go any deeper than that. You have to ask more questions than, is this what I see, and is what I see everything that there is to be seen?
Well, it's the notion of looking at the bigger picture, right? Like in our lives, in our day-to-day, rudimentary, trench-based existence, we only have a very small amount of input that's coming in that we need to process, delete, distort, and generalize to be able to have a healthy mindset. And that's okay. And we need to be comfortable backing our opinions with facts. If we want to raise our voice and say, this is how I feel, we need to be prepared for someone who doesn't feel that way to say why, and for us not to be triggered into a defensive, ridiculous, posterity-based argument that is a quibble, like a sophist, that isn't
Yes.
interested in being right, but in being the winner of the argument.
And on the other side of that, be the one who calmly asks why instead of, throwing the conversation into a rage. You have to be able to de-escalate it when it needs to be, and still argue your point with all of your vigor and all of your resources.
Yes, calmly questioning, and take a lot of lessons from Socrates here, because he knows he's not wise, and he's comfortable asking questions of an individual who thinks that they are, to get to the root contradiction or the root universal truth, which is all he's ever sought out, is universal truths that can be applied to every situation, and contradictions that undermine false arguments. And when people get elated and excited and they bring emotion into the argument, it all falls apart, as you see in this court case, because obviously he's not a corrupter of youth. He does believe in gods, and that's not really the issue. They just want him to shut up. And he's a type. He's a predictable type, because if he wasn't a predictable type, we probably wouldn't be talking about him. And there are people and the gadflies that will appear in every society. You cannot kill Socrates. What he's done, what he's been doing, it's been done before, it'll be done again. There's always going to be someone that's asking the question, until the point that we get to a complete dictatorship where there is no freedom of speech, where we're not allowed to have a healthy dialogue, and we're not allowed to find out what is right, what is wrong, what is objective truth, what is subjective reasoning, all of these things. If you shut down freedom of speech, then you'll lose this type, and that would be a very horrifying society to live in.
Yeah, and an example of a book without any gadflies in it might be Animal Farm, by George Orwell.
Yes.
And all the animals weren't able to do anything when the pigs took over, and they put all the rules in place. No one questioned any of their rules, and no one said anything when the rules kept changing.
I'm glad you brought up Animal Farm, because that's definitely a book we should read soon, because it's so applicable to what's going on in society right now. The unquestioned truths that are being perpetuated by these pigs. You have a bunch of farm animals that just have their role to play, and they go along with this story that's told to them. And there's one individual, I believe his name is Moses, in Animal Farm, the crow.
I'm not sure, I don't recall. It's been a while since I read it.
And he represents religion, I believe. And he isn't a Socratic character, don't get me wrong. He doesn't gadfly it up. But he is
right.
So
You're right, there is a crow.
Aware.
Because he goes between all the farms, and he connects them and gives each other messages.
Yes, and he gets it, but he has no interest in trying to affect change, because he sees the bigger picture, the sinusoidal relationship with classist struggles of the uprising of the middle, chopping off the head of the Hydra, becoming the upper class and recreating a middle and lower class.
With characters like Socrates in the mix, it's a lot harder to get, an absolute authoritarian control over the people, because no one's saying, hey, this rule doesn't really make sense when you look at this rule, or this definition doesn't really make sense if you look at the other definitions around it. You need to have those Socratic dialogues to fix all the problems before you can impose an absolute, philosophical ruler that Socrates might even argue towards putting in place.
Yes, but he wouldn't do it himself because, of course, he knows he's not wise, which is a bummer, because I think if I was to choose anyone, Socrates might very well do some great good as a philosophical man-god leader.
Yeah, because he's just so open. He's able to listen to other people's arguments and take them in as just another piece of the puzzle instead of an opposing opinion.
And that's exactly what we need, right? Is someone who can, and I think not just someone, but all men, all women, all people kind need to be able to say, look, this is a person. Their existence is validated because they exist. That doesn't mean they oppose me because I don't understand them.
Exactly.
It means that they exist and they have a role to play, and with Socratic dialogue, with analysis and conversation, we can all work together. We can reach a place where we have understanding and simpatico.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes through in Marcus Aurelius's work of meditations too.
Oh, so very much. There's some really fantastic self-analysis lessons in Marcus Aurelius's meditations.
Yeah.
If people could read that, absorb that, and say, maybe I'm what's wrong with this situation. Maybe my emotions have conflated two very different ideas into something that is stopping progress.
Yeah, and I think a great metaphor for Marcus Aurelius was, he was one of the guys that showed us how to have a Socratic dialogue with ourselves. Like, ask yourself the question, ask yourself why you're doing this, why, is this really what you want, kind of thing.
I think it's maybe book 11, 10 or 11, where he's got like the list of things where if he feels he's been wronged by a man, he needs to first analyze this and then that and then this and it's just fantastic because that's mindfulness. That's inward introspection, and it's something that is missed so much because everyone wants to be right, it feels, these days. They just want to be right. They're sophisticated, which of course is rooted in Sophists, right?
Yeah. Like sophisticated and educated people that see themselves as better than anybody else kind of miss the point of education, in my opinion.
Absolutely, because if you truly had the education to understand your opposer, we'll call it using their terms, then you'd know that there's no opposition here. There is simply room for growth.
Absolutely.
That they want to affect change without actually really assessing the situation. They think, oh, I've got this set of beliefs. I picked them up in a book and I agree with them heavily, even though these sets of beliefs have been applied upon tens of countries, hundreds of thousands of years over the years, and haven't worked, or maybe they have, and they're missing the piece, and they just want to make an impact and create lasting change. Well, it doesn't work.
You have to do the work. You can't just grab all the information and expect to be the one of right opinion.
You can't just say, this is how it's going to work now, and anybody that disagrees with me is wrong, and you can't talk at the universities. That isn't, I can tell you right now, has a few warning flags attached to it.
You can definitely see how, Socrates' dialogues are the reason why so many people these days value free speech. Because they can see the value in showing the wrong argument and comparing it to the right argument, and you get a lot more out of both sides when you cross-examine the both of them instead of just taking what you accept as the right opinion and casting off everything else. There's always something that can be learned from a wrong opinion, because there's always going to be a reason why that wrong opinion exists. You just have to find the cause of it. Like when we were
Yeah.
talking about analyzing yourself to find where your anxiety comes from. So yeah, there's a really good quote by Socrates that says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And that pops up
Yes.
again in Meditations as well, which is why I say that Marcus Aurelius really did a good job of showing us how to do a Socratic dialogue with ourselves and truly examine ourselves, and to get the point across that you really have to, or, it's not worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have that same quote written down here too, because Socrates says, "Look, this is the point. Like, it's just not worth living. If you're not going to look into what it is you're doing, then what's the point?" And that is my purpose, is to look into what everyone's doing. And if you're to tell me that I need to stop what I'm doing or die, I will choose death every time. I will not stop philosophizing, because just that, an unexamined life is not worth living. And if you won't do it, I'll do it for you. That's why I'm here.
That's the purpose of the Gadfly. To bite you enough times to make you examine yourself. To ask the question, why is this Gadfly biting me? Why is it so focused on me? What am I doing wrong? What's wrong with me that, the flies are coming for me?
And of course, that's why you bring up Marcus Aurelius, because we can each become our own gadfly in a sense, and
Yes.
check into what it is that we're doing wrong. And I think that really physiologically, we have those gadflies inside and outside of us. When we do wrong things, we manifest gadflies, and if we don't examine them, we live in a very weird state of being. You sit on a chair for 15 hours a day, and then you get home and you wonder, why are my hips so tense? Well, I can tell you right now why they're so tense. And in fact, they're tense to tell you that you need to stand up every hour and you need to stretch it out. And when you make wrong choices and do things that cause you to feel guilty or ashamed or anxious or whatever negative emotion that's manifesting, that those are the gadflies. And that if you have tuned into your own intuition, your own internal spirit and self-consciousness that says, this isn't how I want to live my life, and you meditate and you examine and explore your life, you can find that there's all sorts of symbols that are appearing to guide you to the right direction. Except when you don't want to change, when you don't feel that you can change, when you think that life happens to you, that you don't happen to life, that you are an effect of the world, and that you are not the cause and creator of all of your life's choices, that you feel ways based on other people's actions. When you shift the blame away from yourself and you don't take full responsibility for who and what you are, then the gadflies disappear. The world becomes irritating. Your job becomes difficult. Your wife becomes stressful. Your children are annoying. Your food doesn't taste good. Your bed doesn't sleep well. The shows on TV aren't worth watching, and you slip into bad habits. If you can't in yourself want to change, if you can't believe that you have created everything that you currently experience, the good, the bad, the ugly, then you won't be able to make that change. The only change you can make is all of the change that you wish you could and feel you can. And it's very hard. You cannot explain to someone that they have control. They need to realize that on their own.
That's another dichotomy that we see portrayed in Atlas Shrugged, where there's only 2 or 3 gadflies in that story, and everyone else is just completely content with not examining themselves or anybody else, just keep going forward and droning along, not feeling responsible for your life because it's always somebody else's fault.
Yeah. And it makes me think of the scene, with the train, where the reporter finally realizes he hasn't asked, who is John Galt? And Dagny says, we are. And it's like, yeah, exactly. The question isn't who is John Galt, rhetorical. The question is, I am John Galt. What am I going to do?
John Galt is the gadfly.
It's empowering, to be able to say, I am responsible for everything that's happened to me. I am going to be responsible for everything that will happen to me. I'm going to make every single action I can to create the life that I want and to impact the world in a way that I think will be good. And I'm going to question every step of the way whether or not I'm on the right track.
Absolutely. And the last thing that it really deals with in Apology is Socrates' acceptance of death, because he talks about his inner oracle again, his demon, and that it hasn't notified him that he has made a wrong step, because as we've already discussed, that the demon tells him when he's made a mistake, and then he won't say something if he believes that he shouldn't, or if his demon tells him that he shouldn't. And when he fully accepts death and says, I'm fine with you killing me, if that's really what you want, his demon is silent and it just remains peaceful. So he surmises that death can't be all good or all evil. If it's a dreamless sleep or an afterlife where we meet all the dead, it's still an overall good, or at least not evil, which is
A good or a neutral?
highly contrarian to, the Christian theology, where death is an evil that's snatching us away.
Yeah, and without that internal note from his spirit, he establishes it's a good or a neutral. At the very least,
Yes.
it's neutral. And that's an interesting notion.
For sure. You see it paralleled in some of the Eastern religions too. It's definitely in opposition to the Christian view.
Is it? Do they fear death?
I'm not really sure if it's a fear per se, but it definitely is described as evil, or at least not so good.
I mean, there's hell, which is definitely in the Christian view a bad place for bad people, but that heaven is this place of returning home, that we were souls before earth and we were meant to be trialed, and that when we die, having lived a good life, we return to heaven. And there's actually this story about a quote from one of the verses of the Bible that I'm not going to even attempt to try to remember which verse, maybe Matthew, that God is like the silver refiner, constantly sitting and watching us. And there was this Bible group that actually was studying this verse, and they're like, I don't get it. What's a silver refiner? And the one woman went and watched a man refine silver. And the way you refine silver is you sit and you stare at it while it's in the heat, and you stare at it and it burns off the impurities. And if you wait even just a second too long, it completely destroys the silver. And she asks this silver refiner, well, how do you know when it's done? And he says, when I can see my reflection in it.
Huh.
And so the whole purpose in the Christian view of this world, this life that we're given, is to be put under fire, to be put in trial, to burn off our impurities and become like reflections of God. And at that point, we are ready to do what we're meant to do. And when we return home, we are accepted with open arms.
That's kind of beautiful.
Isn't it? I was reading this book for work for my life coaching practice, and it came up. And I have a hard time reading about religion, especially when it's not the point of the book and it's thrown in almost over the top. But that one really stuck out to me. I was like, that is beautiful.
Yeah, that's like a perfect metaphor. You work at something and remove the impurities until you can see yourself in it, and then it's ready. And for that to work, you have to truly have a love for yourself too.
Yes.
You can't see your work as beautiful and free of impurities if you think that you're full of impurities yourself.
Exactly. And that's our whole point, I'd say, is to do things and be dissatisfied with things and look within to see where we can improve, to do things better, to make things good and wholesome and ethical and moral.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end.
Sounds good to me. I'll see you next week.
All right. May the force be with you.
And also with you.